February 1940. The room was suffocating and sterile, bathed in the cruel light of a Moscow winter. This was not a public courtroom where justice was displayed. This was a dissection pit, a slaughterhouse disguised as the supreme military tribunal. The air was thick with the smell of cold sweat, old cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of unconcealed fear. The walls seemed to contract, pressing in on the few silent figures seated within. In the center of that morbid silence was a small, pathetic figure, huddled in an ill-fitting prisoner's uniform. This was Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov. To millions of Soviet citizens, this name was synonymous with hell. He was the malicious dwarf, the bloody prosecutor, the architect of the Great Terror. Only a year prior, his image had been ubiquitous, standing shoulder to shoulder with the leaders, a symbol of unsparing purge. The iron fist of the NKVD, who had drowned a nation in blood and tears. But the man trembling before this secret court was no tyrant. This was a cornered beast, a wretch stripped of his claws. Yezhov had lost dozens of pounds. His face was puffy from beatings and sleepless nights. His eyes, once razor-sharp, were now vacant and tear-filled. He whimpered, tears and snot running unchecked down his face. "Comrade Stalin," he stammered, his voice choked with sobs. The judges, once his subordinates, men who had not dared to meet his gaze, now looked through him with cold disdain. "I did everything for you," Yezhov wailed, trying to stand straight but his legs failing him. "I purged 14,000 Chekists. But my greatest mistake was, I didn't purge enough. You are surrounded by enemies." He spoke like a madman, a frantic zealot attempting to recite his final prayer. He recounted his loyalty, how he had cleansed the party, cleansed the army. He confessed to torture, to coerced confessions, to murder. He was proud of it, but he absolutely denied the charges that he himself had leveled against millions of others. Espionage, conspiracy to treason, sabotage. I am accused of being a spy for Germany, for Britain, for Japan, for Poland. If I was a spy, why did I destroy so many spies? The logic of a deranged mind echoed in the silent room. Then, in a final desperate turn, he addressed the most bizarre charge: homosexuality and debauchery. Instead of denying it, he admitted it with strange resignation, as if that were the only sin he truly understood. The trial was a farce, a hastily staged play. The verdict had been decided months ago, when Stalin's protective hand had withdrawn from him. The judge, Vasily Ulrich, a sentencing machine, began to read. His voice was monotone, unemotional, gliding over crimes against the state, imaginary conspiracies. Yezhov no longer heard anything. He merely stared into space, his body swaying slightly. And then the final words rang out: death by execution. To be shot immediately. The silence was broken. Yezhov collapsed. He did not scream. He did not resist. He simply crumpled like a puppet whose strings were cut. "Tell Comrade Stalin," he mumbled through his sobs. "Tell him that I will die with his name on my lips. Tell him I am innocent." Two burly guards advanced. They did not look him in the face. They hauled Yezhov up by his armpits. His feet dragged across the stone floor. He was pitifully small between the two giants. The heavy door at the end of the room opened, revealing a dark corridor. Yezhov was dragged away, his desperate sobbing fading until it was gone. The door slammed shut. The justice of the darkness had been served. The Soviet Union's greatest executioner had become the latest victim of the machine he himself had started. But how could such a small, ordinary, and nondescript creature climb to the peak of absolute power, becoming the terror of 1/6 of the globe? To understand the monster, we must strip away the tyrant's mask to see the servant within. We must go back to the beginning. Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov entered this world almost unnoticed. Born in 1895, his background was a mess of lies and suspicious blanks. He claimed to be born in St. Petersburg to a Russian factory worker family, but evidence suggests he might have been born in Lithuania or Poland. Even who he wasn't sure. The only clear thing about Yezhov was his mediocrity. He was only 1.51 meters tall, 4 feet 11 inches. In a nation obsessed with grandiose symbols of power, Yezhov was a physical anomaly. Short, scrawny, with a pointed face and protruding ears. He was the epitome of an anonymous person, someone you would pass on the street without a second thought. His education was almost non-existent, just enough to read and write. He tried working as a tailor, a metal worker, but nowhere did he truly excel. When the revolution broke out, he was a low-ranking soldier with no heroic feats, no ideals. He joined the Bolshevik Party not out of ideological conviction, but because it was the only path for someone like him to survive and advance. For years, Yezhov was a literal cog in the Soviet bureaucratic machine. He worked in provincial party committees, a diligent organizer, a blind obedient. He had no thoughts of his own. He had no clear personal ambitions, other than the desire to please his superiors. It was this lack of personality, this moral vacuum, that made him the perfect instrument. Superiors found Yezhov to be an ideal enforcer. He never asked questions. He never hesitated. If ordered to destroy a village, he would ask how many houses needed to be destroyed. If ordered to purge a party cell, he would ask how many bullets were needed. His career was a slow but steady ascent through the ranks of the bureaucracy. He wasn't intelligent, but he compensated with ruthlessness and diligence. He was willing to do the dirty work that others, the more educated and idealistic old guard Bolsheviks, found repulsive. And then, in the late 1920s, he caught the eye of the supreme power. Joseph Stalin, who was consolidating his absolute power, didn't need the clever or the independent. He needed enforcers. He needed hands willing to be stained with blood without trembling. Stalin looked at Yezhov and saw a reflection of absolute, almost canine loyalty. Stalin brought Yezhov to Moscow, placing him in key positions within the Central Committee. First, the Ministry of Agriculture, where Yezhov oversaw the brutal collectivization, witnessing millions of peasants starve without a flicker of emotion. Then he was moved to the Central Control Commission, the body that oversaw internal party discipline. This is where Yezhov found his true calling. He became Stalin's eyes and ears. He built internal information networks, recording every whisper, every complaint. He meticulously compiled dossiers on every high-ranking official, storing their secrets, their weaknesses. He was not just an official. He was a spider, silently weaving his web in the shadows of the Kremlin. When Stalin decided that the head of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda, had become too soft, too slow in carrying out the purges, there was only one obvious candidate for the replacement. In September 1936, Nikolai Yezhov, the nobody from nowhere, was summoned. Stalin looked at the short man standing before him, a man with nothing but sick loyalty, and handed him the keys to hell. Stalin called him my dwarf, but the world was about to know him by another name, a name written in the blood of millions. The reign of terror, Yezhovshchina, was about to begin. September 1936. Nikolai Yezhov walked into the Lubyanka headquarters, not as an official, but as a new master. The atmosphere in the massive gray stone building immediately changed. It became colder, tenser. The smell of leather, cigarettes, and a permanent metallic odor of fear seemed to emanate from the very walls. Yezhov wasted no time. He was a machine, and he had come to build a bigger machine. First task, purge the purgers themselves. Genrikh Yagoda, his predecessor, was arrested. Yezhov had to root out Yagoda's foundation. Thousands of NKVD agents who were accustomed to torture and killing now tasted the very poison they had administered. The interrogation rooms of Lubyanka, once used to torture enemies of the people, now echoed with the screams of Chekist agents themselves. Yezhov was creating a new apparatus, one loyal only to him, and through him to Stalin. With the apparatus cleansed, Yezhov embarked on the main task. He was not an ideologue. He was an executor, and the order he received was clear: eliminate every threat, real or imagined, to Stalin's power. On July 30th, 1937, Yezhov signed the fateful document that would carve his name into history with blood, the infamous NKVD Operational Order number 00447. This was not a legal document. This was a license for mass murder. Order 00447 was a blueprint for hell. It classified all anti-Soviet and socially harmful elements into two categories. Category 1, the most hostile, to be arrested immediately and to be shot. Category 2, less active but still hostile. to be arrested, and sent to Gulag camps for 8 to 10 years. But the most monstrous part of Order 00447 lay in the numbers. Yezhov, with the mindset of a sick accountant, set quotas for each region, each republic. Hundreds of thousands of people were planned for arrest. Tens of thousands were planned for execution. This was no longer justice, however twisted the Bolshevik kind. This was the industrialization of murder. To execute this plan, Yezhov created the Troika, special committees of 3 people, typically consisting of the local party secretary, the prosecutor, and the regional NKVD head. These troikas were the court, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. A troika trial could take mere minutes. No defendant, no defense lawyer, no witnesses, just a list of names and a decision to be stamped. Shot. 10 years. Shot. Shot. Hundreds of names were processed in a single night. The terror machine began to accelerate. Voronezh. The black trucks began prowling the streets of every city, every town at midnight. The knock on the door at 3 a.m. became the sound of the Soviet Union. One knock meant a life had ended. Husbands were arrested in front of their wives and children. Wives were dragged away, leaving children abandoned. The prisons were overflowing. Lubyanka, Butyrka, Lefortovo. The names became synonymous with torture. But Yezhov needed confessions. Stalin needed proof, however fabricated, of widespread conspiracies. And Yezhov delivered. The NKVD interrogation rooms became factories for confessions. The torture methods went beyond the most brutal imagination. The most famous was the conveyor. Prisoners were continuously interrogated by a rotating team of investigators, non-stop for days, even weeks. They were not allowed to sleep. As soon as one collapsed, they were splashed with cold water, beaten until they woke up and the interrogation continued. "Sign it," the investigator whispered into the ear of a university professor who hadn't slept for 7 days. "Sign the confession that you are a Japanese spy. Sign it and you can sleep." Under that torture, the human mind shattered. Heroic Red Army generals confessed to plotting to overthrow the state they fought to defend. Great writers confessed to planning to assassinate party officials. Scientists confessed to sabotaging their own laboratories. They confessed to poisoning water wells, ruining harvests, spying for Germany, Britain, Japan, Poland, Finland, even New Zealand. They confessed to the most absurd things just to end the pain. Yezhov personally supervised the most important interrogations. He paced the corridors of Lubyanka, his small stature casting a fear greater than the giant torturers. He read the confessions, striking out details he deemed not convincing enough, and ordered more work with the prisoner. But the target was not just the famous. Yezhov's machine needed fuel. The quotas had to be met. Local NKVD commanders, terrified of Yezhov himself, plunged into a frantic competition. They arrested peasants for telling anti-Soviet jokes. They arrested workers for being 15 minutes late. They arrested housewives for complaining about long bread lines. And when the initial quotas were fulfilled, they did the unbelievable. They wrote to Yezhov praising his brilliant leadership and asking for an increase in the quota. To thoroughly eradicate the remnants of the counter-revolutionaries, one report read, "We propose to increase the Category 1 shooting quota by 5,000 people." Yezhov, satisfied, signed off. The national operations began. Yezhov, perhaps paranoid about his own suspected Polish roots, launched a brutal purge against people of Polish descent. KVD Order 00485 ordered the arrest of all Polish spies. Over 140,000 people were arrested, over 111,000 were shot, simply for having a Polish surname. Then came the German operation, the Latvian operation, the Finnish operation, the Korean operation. Anyone with foreign connections, anyone who spoke another language was a potential enemy. The Soviet Union was eating itself alive, but the peak of the madness was the purge of the Red Army. Stalin, increasingly paranoid, believed the military was plotting against him. Yezhov provided the proof, using savage torture methods. The NKVD forced top military commanders, including Marshal Tukhachevsky, the father of mechanized warfare, to confess to spying for Nazi Germany. In June 1937, The Soviet Union's greatest military minds were hauled out and shot. The Purge decapitated the military. 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders. Over 30,000 officers were arrested or shot. This was a gift Yezhov presented to Hitler, a gift the Nazis would exploit ruthlessly only 4 years later. And where was Yezhov in all this? He was at the peak of his power. He was the most feared man in the Soviet Union. His name was whispered in terror. He reveled in power. He reveled in blood. It is said that he kept the bullets that killed prominent Bolshevik leaders, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, in his desk drawer as souvenirs. In the debauched parties at luxury dachas, Yezhov, drunk on vodka, would boast about his work. He would laugh out loud, telling stories of how he broke a hardened general. He would dance, his small figure moving oddly, while around him his subordinates laughed out of sheer fear. This reign of terror, lasting from 1937 to 1938, is historically known by one name, Yezhovshchina, the era of Yezhov. In that brief period, his machine arrested over 1.5 million people. Nearly 700,000 of them were shot, killed with a single bullet to the back of the head in the damp cellars of the NKVD across the country. Yezhov created a hell on earth. He turned a nation into a massive prison, where no one was safe, where neighbor denounced neighbor and son denounced father. He achieved the impossible. He instilled a paralyzing fear into every one of the 170 million citizens. He was the architect of destruction, the butcher of the party, and Stalin's most loyal servant. But in the twisted world of the Kremlin, nothing is eternal. The machine Yezhov built was efficient, but it was too indiscriminate. It was starting to threaten the very structure of the state. The hysteria had gone too far, and Joseph Stalin, observing everything from his office, began to realize that his attack dog had become too bloodthirsty. Stalin didn't need a fanatic. He needed a scapegoat. The wheel of history, which Yezhov had spun to a dizzying speed, was now beginning to slow down, and it was preparing to crush the very man who had started it. In 1938, the terror machine began to show signs of faltering. It had been running too hot for too long. The hysteria of the Yezhovshchina was not only destroying enemies, but also tearing apart the very fabric of the Soviet state. Factories lost their engineers, mines lost their workers, research institutes lost their scientists, and most importantly, the Red Army was decapitated, losing almost its entire senior officer corps. At the peak of his power, Joseph Stalin looked down and saw chaos. He was not a fool. He was a master of power, and he understood that this chaos, if left unchecked, would eventually consume him. The Great Terror had served its purpose. It had solidified Stalin's absolute power, eliminated every opponent, real or imagined, and instilled a paralyzing fear in every citizen. But now it had become a liability. The economy was on the verge of collapse. The military was incapable of fighting, and on the western border, a new threat, Adolf Hitler, was growing increasingly aggressive. Stalin needed stability. He needed the state machine to start working again, and to do that, he needed a scapegoat. The populace was exhausted with fear. Millions had been arrested, and each one of them had family, friends. An undercurrent of resentment and confusion was spreading. They couldn't blame Stalin, the father of the peoples who was proclaimed infallible by propaganda. So they blamed the security apparatus, the overzealous local officials, the ones who went too far, and no one symbolized that going too far more clearly than Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov, in his frenzy of blood and power, had failed to notice the shift in the air. He still believed he was the most loyal attack dog, still busy chasing shadows. He had become too prominent, too notorious. His name, Yezhovshchina, was tied to the darkest period. He knew too much, or had seen too much, and most importantly, had signed too many death warrants in Stalin's name. Such a man could not be allowed to live. He was a walking archive of the regime's crimes. Stalin began to act slowly, methodically, like a spider setting a trap for its prey. The first sign came in the summer of 1938. Stalin deliberately brought a new man into the NKVD's inner circle. His name was Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria. Beria was completely different from Yezhov. He was a Georgian, like Stalin, A cunning schemer, a sharp and brutal intellect hidden behind a pair of round-rimmed glasses. If Yezhov was a fanatic, an obedient machine, Beria was a politician, a conspirator, someone who understood the true nature of power. He came from the Caucasus, where he had conducted his own purges more efficiently and cleanly. Stalin appointed Beria as Yezhov's first deputy. It was a stroke of genius. On the surface, it was support for the overburdened Yezhov, but in reality, it was a delayed death sentence. Yezhov immediately understood the threat. He had seen this scenario before. He himself had played Beria's role when overthrowing Yagoda. The atmosphere in Lubyanka became tense. Yezhov, once the absolute tyrant, now faced an equal rival, a man with direct backing from Stalin. Beria began to plant his own people in key positions within the NKVD. He started reviewing dossiers, discovering flaws in Yezhov's investigations. He did it quietly, gathering evidence in no hurry. Yezhov began to panic. The intoxication of power vanished, replaced by the primitive fear he had sown in millions. He started drinking more, wildly. His debauched parties became wilder and more desperate. He tried to cling to power, trying to prove his loyalty by working harder, signing more arrest warrants. But it was too late. The ship had sailed. Stalin began to publicly criticize the NKVD. At a Politburo meeting, Stalin complained about indiscriminate arrests and flawed interrogation methods. He didn't look at Yezhov when he said it, but the message was clear. Yezhov, pale-faced, sat still as a stone. The decisive blow came in November 1938. Stalin summoned Yezhov and Beria. He presented a document, a draft resolution on the reorganization of the NKVD apparatus. This document, prepared by Beria, was a public indictment of the Yezhovshchina. It condemned the use of indiscriminate torture, as if Stalin himself hadn't ordered it, the arrest of innocent people, and the NKVD's failure to track down real spies. Yezhov was humiliated. He was forced to sign the document admitting his own incompetence. A few days later, Yezhov wrote a desperate letter to Stalin, a tear-filled letter from a wretch. He took all the blame, begged for forgiveness, and offered to resign from the NKVD. He pleaded to be spared his life, to be given any job, no matter how small. To atone, Stalin, in a final act of cruelty, accepted Yezhov's resignation from the NKVD and appointed him People's Commissar for Water Transport. It was a cruel joke. The man who held the lives of millions was now in charge of boats and barges. Yezhov was stripped of his NKVD uniform. He was stripped of his power. He was stripped of his protection. Lavrentiy Beria officially became the new head of the NKVD. And what was the first thing Beria did? He started a new purge, the purging of Yezhov's purgers. Beria needed to clean the apparatus, eliminate the witnesses, and pin all the blame for the Great Terror on his predecessor. For Yezhov, the following months were a living nightmare. He was a walking corpse. He came to the Water Transport Commissariat office every day, but no one spoke to him. Former colleagues avoided his gaze. People who had once begged for his favor now crossed the street when they saw him. He was completely isolated. Yezhov lived in extreme fear, waiting for the knock on the door at midnight. He knew it would come. It was the procedure he himself had perfected. He spent his days in a fog of vodka, paranoia, and despair. He saw his former subordinates, the men who had tortured and killed with him, being arrested one by one. He tried to call Stalin. The phone was never connected. He tried to write letters. No response. The old man had abandoned him. The hunt had begun. Beria was in no hurry. He was collecting evidence. He arrested Yezhov's closest associates, his lovers, both male and female, and tortured them. Under torture, they confessed that Yezhov was not only an overzealous man, but also a German spy, a conspirator to overthrow Stalin, a debauched homosexual. The charges were identical to those Yezhov had used against Yagoda, against Tukhachevsky, against millions of others. The irony was perfect. Finally, on April 10, 1939, the wait ended. Yezhov was in his office trying to concentrate on some meaningless papers about river transport. The door opened. Lavrentiy Beria walked in, followed by two massive NKVD agents. Yezhov didn't even look up. He knew. Nikolai Ivanovich, Beria said, his thick Georgian accent almost a whisper. "The comrade is requested to come with us. You are arrested by order of the Central Committee." Yezhov did not resist. He didn't say a word. He stood up, small and trembling. He allowed the agents to handcuff him. The man who had been the terror of a nation, the malicious dwarf, the bloody prosecutor, was arrested like a common criminal. He was taken to Sukhanovo prison, a former monastery that the NKVD had turned into a special torture prison, a hell on earth that Yezhov himself had overseen the construction of. The cell door slammed shut. Yezhov was plunged into darkness. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. And Beria's investigators, trained in his own methods, were sharpening their tools. The cycle of violence had closed. The executioner had now become the prisoner, awaiting his final trial. Sukhanovo prison was no ordinary jail. It was Yezhov's special creation, a bespoke torture laboratory. Located outside Moscow, the former monastery had been converted into a site from which no one returned. It was soundproofed, heavily guarded, and run by the most brutal elements of the NKVD apparatus. Yezhov had built it to break the will of the hardest enemies. Now he was its guest. For almost 10 months, Nikolai Yezhov vanished from the world. To the outside, he had simply been transferred. But inside the walls of Sukhanovo, he was tasting the very hell he had created. But with a difference. Lavrentiy Beria, the new head of the NKVD, did not need fantastic confessions about international espionage for public display. The time for show trials where the old guard Bolshevik defendants smeared themselves was over. Beria needed something else from Yezhov. He needed a plausible confession, one that could be used to legitimize Yezhov's own purge and close the dark chapter of the Yezhovshchina. Beria's investigators, brutal and professional, went to work. They did not treat Yezhov like a former people's commissar. They treated him like trash. But Yezhov, the wretch, collapsed almost immediately. He did not need the prolonged conveyor torture. The sheer terror, the isolation, and the stripping away of all power shattered him. He was ready to confess to anything. Under the guidance of the investigators, Yezhov wrote dozens of pages of confession. It was a bizarre text, a mix of truth, lies, and the self-delusion of a man who had lost his mind. He confessed to being an enemy of the people. He confessed to plotting against Stalin. Although he maintained deep down he always loved the old man. He admitted to using illegal torture methods, a blatant lie, as Stalin himself had authorized them. He confessed to negligence, to letting real spies like Yagoda, whom he himself had killed, infiltrate the NKVD, and then the personal confessions. He admitted in detail to his debauched sexual life, confessing to homosexual relations, a serious crime under Soviet law at the time. He listed the names of his male lovers who were subsequently arrested and shot. He seemed to find a morbid release in soiling himself, as if by admitting to these small sins, he could be forgiven for his genocidal crimes. But one thing he steadfastly denied. He was never a spy. For Yezhov, that was the ultimate insult. He could be a murderer, a torturer, a debauchee, but he was a Soviet communist. "I purged 14,000 Chekists," he wrote in a desperate letter to Beria and Stalin. "But my greatest mistake was that I didn't purge enough. I didn't purge you when I still could." On February 2nd, 1940, nearly a year after his arrest, Yezhov was informed that his trial would take place. The trial, like everything else related to his fall, was a secret farce. It was held at the Supreme Military Tribunal, in the very room where he had once judged the fates of others. The judges sat there, including Vasily Ulrich, the bloody judge, who had signed thousands of death sentences at Yezhov's command. Now Ulrich looked at Yezhov with an impassive face, as if he were a complete stranger. Yezhov, trembling, was brought into the room. He was a shadow of his former self, emaciated, pale, filthy. He was no longer the malicious dwarf. He was just a dwarf. The indictment was read, treason, organizing an anti-Soviet conspiracy within the NKVD, preparing terrorist acts against party leadership, and spying for German and British intelligence. Upon hearing the espionage charge, Yezhov suddenly resisted. "That is a lie," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I fought against spies. I destroyed them." He launched into a final, frantic, and self-contradictory speech. He denied all political conspiracies. He proclaimed his eternal loyalty to Stalin. "Tell Comrade Stalin," he cried, "that I will die with his name on my lips. Tell him it was all a misunderstanding." And then, in a moment of raw truth, he admitted it all. "Yes, I was debauched," he told the court. "But I did my job. I cleansed the party. I cleansed the army. My sin is not what I did, but what I failed to do." He begged. He pleaded. He groveled. He offered to be sent to the Gulag to do any work, just to be allowed to live. He said he could still be useful to the party. The court deliberated for a few minutes. It was only a formality. Ulrich returned and began to read the sentence. His voice was flat, mechanical. Guilty of treason, terrorist conspiracy, death by execution. To be shot immediately, Yezhov collapsed. He had no more words. He only sobbed. 2 guards, twice his size, stepped forward and hauled him up. He was dragged out of the courtroom, his small feet shuffling on the floor. There was no delay, no last words. Stalin's justice, Beria's justice, was swift and efficient. Yezhov was taken to a special basement right in the building. It was not a typical execution chamber. It was a room specially designed, with a sloped floor and a drain to facilitate the cleanup of blood. Waiting for him was Vasily Blokhin. Blokhin was a legendary figure in the NKVD. He was Stalin's chief executioner, a large, emotionless man who had personally executed tens of thousands. Blokhin viewed his work as an art. He always wore a butcher's leather apron, a cap, and long gloves to keep the blood off his uniform. Yezhov, who had once been Blokhin's superior, who had signed Blokhin's promotions, was now his prisoner. Yezhov was pushed into the room. He was probably too shocked to realize what was happening. He was forced to kneel. Blokhin, without a word, pulled out his Walther PPK pistol, a German sidearm he favored for its reliability, and placed the muzzle against the back of Yezhov's head. A single shot rang out, muffled by the thick walls. The small body of Nikolai Yezhov convulsed and slumped to the floor. The reign of terror of the Yezhovshchina ended with a single bullet, carried out by the very system he had built and perfected. His body, like the hundreds of thousands of his other victims, was immediately cremated at the Donskoy crematorium. His ashes were thrown into one of the anonymous mass graves. No tombstone, no trace. The final punishment was not death. It was obliteration. Immediately after Yezhov's arrest, Beria ordered another purge, the purge of memory. Yezhov's name was removed from articles. His works were recalled, and in the most symbolic act, NKVD photo retouchers went to work. The photographs of Yezhov standing next to Stalin, the images that had once symbolized his ultimate power, were now altered. Most famous was the picture of Stalin and Molotov next to Yezhov on a canal. In the new version, Yezhov vanished. Only the water and the empty railing remained. Nikolai Yezhov, the man who had killed so many, had now himself become a vanished person. He was erased from photographs, erased from history books, erased from reality itself. He had become a ghost, a final, anonymous, and pathetic victim of the destructive machine he had commanded, with a blind loyalty and limitless brutality. The wheel of history had come full circle, crushing the executioner under the very weight of the crimes he had committed.